doesn't come with gunfire, but with silence. Two strangers are forced to do something they never imagined. Lie beside each other. And share the last warmth left in a world that's already given up on them. He's human. She's alien, violet eyes, trembling in the dark. They didn't need words. They just knew. If they didn't touch tonight, there would be no tomorrow. But the cold didn't kill them. It only brought them closer. And when their breath mingled, when skin met skin, it awakened something ancient. Something deeper than the instinct to survive. And when she whispered, "Don't let go," he realized this wasn't just survival anymore. This was the edge between life and something far more dangerous. Feeling. The wind didn't howl, it screamed. Long, feral, and endless, like something alive and furious. Snow slashed sideways through the air, not drifting but attacking, each flake a tiny shard of glass driven by a storm with no mercy. The sky above was a swirling void, white and angry, swallowing every point of reference. Out of that madness came a streak of fire. A shuttle, small and struggling, plunged downward, trailing black smoke, its hull torn open in places, its engines choking against the cold. Metal groaned. Alarms shrieked. Flames danced across fractured panels like wild spirits. Inside the cockpit, Ronald fought the controls, gritting his teeth. Muscles tight. Gloves slick with blood or sweat, maybe both. Hold together, just hold. But machines don't listen when gravity decides. The shuttle slammed into the frozen ridge with a sound that tore the world in half. It didn't crash, it shattered. Then, nothing. A dim red light blinked in the wreckage, casting broken shadows across twisted metal. Vents hissed quietly. Somewhere deeper inside the shattered fuselage, the storm still screamed, demanding entry. Ronald moved. Barely. His body was scraped, burned, beaten but not broken. He crawled from the torn open cockpit, dragging himself into the storm's open mouth. Outside was worse than hell. The planet didn't feel dead, it felt ancient and awake. Jagged ice clawed toward the sky. Every breath stung like needles. Snow covered everything in a thick, silent burial. And the wind sounded like it was hunting something. His boots crunched on frost that bit back. His breath came out in heavy, white clouds. The thermal regulator in his suit flickered, trying to compensate. Failing. No comms. No signal. No heat. Just cold. Endless. Absolute. And Ronald knew, without needing a second opinion. If help didn't come soon, this place would be his grave. The station felt like a tomb. Not abandoned, entombed. Its walls groaned under the weight of years, warped by cold, stitched with frost. Metal beams creaked overhead like the breath of something sleeping, or something that had died but never fully left. Ice clung to every surface, creeping in slow, jagged tendrils across glass, steel, and silence. Ronald stepped inside cautiously. Each footfall echoed not loudly, but just enough to remind him how alone he was. His light flickered across the decaying interior, consoles frozen mid-function, shattered monitors staring back like blind eyes. The outpost had once held purpose, maybe even life. Now it held only the cold. His thermal suit pulsed against his chest, the warning light dull and red. The heat it generated was growing weaker with every minute. He pulled the collar tighter, but the chill had already found its way in. It always did. He moved deeper inside, checking old junctions and power nodes, hoping absurdly for something that still worked. But the systems were long dead. A graveyard of circuits. Then, a sound. So faint he thought it might be imagined. A hush. A breath. Another. He stilled. Listened. It came again, soft, uneven. Breathing. Not wind. Not a machine. Not his own. He turned sharply, light trembling in his gloved hand. His breath quickened, fogging the visor as he stepped toward the far corner. There, half buried in shadow, was a shape. Small. Slumped. Alive. At first he couldn't tell what he was looking at, limbs wrapped tight around a narrow frame, silver hair tangled and matted like wind-blown silk. Her skin shimmered faintly in the dim light, smooth and pale with a bluish tint, almost translucent in places. And across her arms and neck faint glowing patterns, like starlight caught beneath the skin. She wasn't human. But she was breathing. Barely. Her body shivered violently, like it was trying to escape itself. Her suit was torn, ragged, nothing more than fabric clinging to survival. And yet, her eyes opened. Violet. Brilliant. Haunted. They locked on his face like she didn't believe he was real. Her voice, when it came, was cracked and thin. You're human. Ronald didn't speak. Didn't need to. He slowly lowered his plasma cutter, letting the glow die out. He looked at her for a moment longer, then said quietly, "And you're freezing." The room was no sanctuary. Just a cramped storage space with walls lined in frost and silence. No light. No warmth. Only the faint creaking of old metal and the distant howl of wind threading through the bones of the outpost. It smelled of rust and something long forgotten. A broken cot leaned against one wall, its legs uneven. In the corner, a pile of tattered blankets, stiff from time and cold. The air inside was no kinder than outside, but it was still, and that counted for something. Ronald lowered her gently onto the cot. Stephanie's body trembled with such intensity that it almost didn't seem real. Not the kind of shivering that could be stopped, but the deep, uncontrollable kind that came when the body had given up warmth long ago and was now just trying to remember it. He watched her for a beat. Then pulled off his jacket, placing it over her shoulders. She flinched at first, but didn't pull away. Her violet eyes met his, guarded, alert but not resisting. "We won't last a night like this," he said, quietly. Her jaw tensed. She swallowed hard. "Then we share." It wasn't a suggestion. Not a plea. Just the cold, hard logic of survival spoken aloud. Ronald nodded, slow. No argument. No second thoughts. "This isn't about comfort," she added, her voice low, more breath than sound. "No," he replied. "It's about staying alive." They shifted together, slowly, as if learning a language they'd never spoken. Lying side by side on the narrow cot, bodies stiff, unsure where to rest or how close was too close. Her back barely brushed against his shoulder. His arm hovered awkwardly near her side. The storm raged on outside, but in here, time began to slow. Her breath touched his collar. His fingers grazed the edge of her hip. And then, silence. Not empty silence. The kind filled with pulses. With breath. With things neither dared name. She spoke first, almost to herself. "Your skin radiates." He turned slightly toward her voice, his chest rising slowly. "You sound surprised." "I didn't think it would feel," she hesitated. "Like this?" And then her hand moved. It didn't startle him. It didn't feel sudden. It was gentle, almost hesitant. She placed her palm over his chest, just above his heart. Not for warmth. Not entirely. It felt more like searching. Like she needed to feel something real beneath the cold. Their eyes met. Neither looked away. No words passed between them, but something deeper did occur, subtle and old, rising from some place far below instinct. Something that didn't care about species, or protocol, or logic. Something human. And not. For a moment, the cold stepped back. And in its place, stillness. But not the kind that comes from absence. The kind that comes just before something begins. The cot creaked beneath them, quiet and tired, but neither moved. Stephanie's hand remained where she had placed it, resting lightly against Ronald's chest. She wasn't gripping him. Wasn't searching for safety. She was simply there. Her skin was still cold, but not hollow like before. The tremors in her frame had eased, as if his warmth had started to melt through the layers of shock and instinct, reaching something deeper. "You're warmer than I thought," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. Ronald let out a soft exhale, the corners of his mouth lifting. "And you're lighter than you look." A quiet breath escaped her lips. Not a laugh. But close. The edge of something human. Then, after a pause, she spoke again. "I don't like this." He glanced at her. The cold. Her head tilted slightly. "No." "Needing someone." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he shifted, slow and steady, letting his body press more fully into hers. Her side touched his chest. Her forehead brushed the line of his jaw. Neither pulled away. "It's not weakness," he said, the words soft-spoken not to convince her, but because he meant them. Stephanie didn't respond. But her fingers moved, curling slightly against him. Not out of reflex. Not survival. Something quieter. Warmer. Outside, the wind howled like a beast just beyond the walls. But inside this small room, something else stirred, fragile, wordless, and alive. Not born from fire. Not even born from heat. Just the absence of loneliness. Time stretched, the edges of each second softened by silence. The blizzard outside still raged, but here inside these thin walls, wrapped in failing warmth and the quiet presence of another, everything felt muted. As if the storm no longer mattered. Stephanie stirred, just slightly. Not to leave. Just to lean in. Her hand moved slowly, gliding up the slope of Ronald's chest, fingertips trailing across worn fabric. The motion wasn't deliberate, but it wasn't accidental either. She paused near his collarbone, her fingers resting there like they had found something they weren't expecting to feel. The trembling that had racked her body earlier was gone now. But the tension, it lingered. Not fear. Not survival. Something more subtle. Something unnamed. "This is working," she murmured, half thought, half confession. Ronald didn't answer right away. He just let the words settle into the space between them. "I noticed," he said finally, his voice low, shaped by quiet. Stephanie turned slightly, enough for him to see the edge of her expression through the strands of silver that framed her face. Her violet eyes held something softer than before, still cautious, but less guarded. "I didn't expect it to feel like this," she said. "The warmth?" he asked gently. "No," she looked at him, eyes searching. "You." The silence that followed didn't feel empty. It felt like air waiting to be filled. Her fingers moved again, tracing the path down his chest with a kind of curious hesitation. Like she was touching not skin, but meaning. "I was told to keep my distance," she said quietly. From your kind. Ronald exhaled through his nose. I wasn't told much about yours. Just enough to fear what we didn't understand. There was a pause. Do you still? She asked. He turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers in a dimness. No. Stephanie's hand drifted once more back to where his heart beat steady beneath her palm. I trust this, she whispered. Ronald didn't speak. He didn't need to. The quiet between them said enough. She drew in a breath, almost a sigh, her fingers sliding up toward his shoulder. There was no trembling in her touch now. Only thoughtfulness. I've never touched a human like this, she said, not with shame, not with pride, just honesty. There's a first time for everything, he said, the corner of his mouth turning. A small, unexpected sound slipped from her, a breath that might have been a laugh. Soft. Almost surprised at itself. I didn't think I'd want to. He looked at her fully now, his voice barely a murmur. And now? She met his gaze without wavering. And this time, there was no hesitation in her reply. I do. The warmth between them had changed. It was no longer about survival. No longer a response to the biting cold just beyond the walls. Something else had begun to stir, subtle, but impossible to ignore. It moved beneath the quiet, threading between breaths and the space where their bodies touched. Stephanie's hand lingered on his chest, not as a gesture of need, but of awareness. Her fingertips traced slow, deliberate lines along the fabric, like she was mapping a memory before it disappeared. Her silver hair brushed his skin as she rested quietly, head against his shoulder, her breathing finally steady. You're still trembling inside, she said softly. Ronald didn't answer right away. His heart was beating faster than it should. Not from fear. Not from cold. Just the weight of this moment. The stillness of it. Can you blame me? He murmured. She didn't respond with words, just a faint press of her lips to the edge of his collarbone. A touch that said she understood. Then, gently, she lifted her head. Her eyes found his and held. There was no question in them. No hesitation. Only something unspoken, something fragile, but real. I don't know what this is, she whispered. Or why it feels so clear? Me neither, he replied. But I don't want it to end. She studied him for a long moment, as if searching for some trace of doubt. But what she found must have been enough. Slowly, quietly, she leaned in. Their lips met. It wasn't rushed. There was no urgency. Just a simple, delicate contact, the kind that didn't demand anything, but offered everything. The kind of kiss that felt like silence made real. When she pulled back, she didn't go far. Her forehead rested against his, her breath warm against his mouth. I didn't think I was capable of feeling this, she said. Ronald's voice was a whisper. I thought I'd forgotten how. The room around them remained unchanged, still cold, still dim, still silent. But in that narrow space, something had shifted. Not in the air. Not in the temperature. In them. Not just warmth. Not just survival. But something human. And something more. Time had stopped measuring itself in minutes. It moved instead in the rise and fall of breath, the shifting warmth between bodies that no longer felt like strangers. Outside, the storm still murmured against the outpost walls, but its fury had faded, no longer howling, only whispering. Like even the wind knew not to intrude. Inside that fragile silence, they remained close. Not from necessity now, but from something quieter. Stephanie lay with her head nestled beneath Ronald's chin, her fingers drifting along his chest, not seeking heat, but anchoring herself to the moment. "You make it easy to forget how cold it is," she murmured. Ronald let out a slow breath, the corner of his mouth softening. "That might be the first compliment I've gotten from an alien." She tilted her head just enough to meet his eyes. Her voice carried something softer now, not distant, not guarded. Just honest. "I wasn't supposed to survive here," she said. "None of this was meant to happen." "You didn't plan for me," he offered gently. She hesitated, then smiled, faint and fleeting. "Especially not you?" They fell quiet again. But it wasn't silence. It was something more fragile, hesitation wrapped in hope. And then she asked it. "What happens when this ends? When the storm clears?" He didn't answer right away. His hand moved slowly along her back, grounding both of them in a now. "I don't know," he said at last. "But I don't want this to disappear just because the danger does." Stephanie studied him, her violet eyes darker in the dimness. She looked like someone afraid of the answer she already knew. "Do you think we get to keep this?" she asked. Ronald paused. His voice, when it came, was steady. "I think we don't let the world decide that for us." She didn't say anything. Just rested her forehead against his chest, listening to his heartbeat like it might give her a truth that words couldn't. "I forgot what it felt like to be seen," she whispered. He pulled her closer, pressing a kiss into her hair. "You're not invisible here?" Outside, the wind faded into a low sigh, almost reverent. And inside that forgotten corner of a dying world, something impossible had taken root. Not because it was planned. Not because it was allowed. But because they needed it to survive, and now they simply needed it. A sound stirred the quiet. Soft. Mechanical. Persistent. It wasn't the wind this time. It pulsed gentle but unmistakable, like a heartbeat buried under layers of silence. Ronald opened his eyes. For a moment, he thought he'd imagined it. But there it was again, rhythmic, steady. He sat up slowly, careful not to disturb her. Stephanie stirred beside him, her breath catching as she, too, heard it. Her eyes found his without a word. He crossed the room, following the faint green light blinking from the old COMM panel, something he'd nearly given up on days ago. He brushed away the frost, fingers trembling as the signal blinked again. Distress acknowledged. Rescue en route. He let out a breath that trembled on its way out. A soft, almost disbelieving laugh slipped through. "It worked," he whispered. But the silence behind him didn't echo his relief. He turned. Stephanie hadn't moved. She was sitting upright, wrapped in the remains of the old blanket, eyes fixed on the blinking panel as if it were something dangerous. Or final. He stepped toward her. "Hey, we're getting out of here?" She didn't answer right away. Her gaze remained distant, her voice barely a breath. "You are." He froze. "What do you mean?" Her fingers curled around the edge of the cot. "I wasn't meant to survive this crash." Ronald's breath caught. "I thought it was just an accident," he said quietly. "It wasn't." She lifted her gaze to him now. No fear, just a calm honesty that cut deeper than panic ever could. "My escape pod was sabotaged. I was the only one ejected. They didn't want me rescued, Ronald. They wanted me gone." He stared at her. The blinking light behind him felt suddenly too bright. Too loud. "Why?" he asked. Stephanie's expression didn't change. "Because I wasn't just a passenger." I was a liability. Someone who knew things I shouldn't. Someone who could speak truths they wanted buried. A beat. If I board that ship, they'll know I'm alive. And they won't let me stay that way. He stepped closer, voice low. Then come with me. We'll tell them you're with me, that I found you, kept you alive. They won't care, she said. Unless they believe I belong to you. Silence stretched between them. Then Ronald spoke, steady and quiet. Then let them believe it. Stephanie looked at him for a long moment. And something in her finally gave way just enough for him to see it. The fear she hadn't dared show, and the hope she'd tried to kill. You don't even know who I really am, she said. I know what you are to me, he answered. Outside, the storm had softened. Inside, everything had changed. A rescue ship was coming. But what they had found here buried under ice, born in silence, was something no one had planned for. And neither of them was ready to let it go. The signal kept pulsing. Soft. Even. Unforgiving. Like a heartbeat that didn't care who heard it. Stephanie stood by the far wall, still wrapped in the worn fabric of what used to be a blanket. The green light from the COMM panel flickered against her skin, casting long, trembling shadows. Her silver hair fell across her face, but her eyes didn't blink. They stayed fixed on the frost-stained window. Fixed on the sky. Ronald watched her in silence. He didn't move. Not yet. You're thinking about leaving, he said, not as a question. Her voice came without turning. Quiet. Controlled. I'm thinking about being taken. He stepped closer. You're not going anywhere without me? She didn't smile. Just breathed, slow and deep, as if trying to hold something inside that was threatening to break free. When they see me, she said, they'll know exactly who I am. And they'll know why I'm still alive. He paused. Then we give them a different reason. She turned her head slightly. Just enough to meet his eyes. And what reason is that? He didn't blink. That you're with me? Stephanie didn't answer right away. Her gaze held his, but behind it there was hesitation. Not fear. Not doubt. Something older. Worn. The weight of too many promises broken before they ever had a chance to mean anything. They won't care, she said softly. People like me don't get rescued. We get erased. Ronald took another step. His voice was steady now, low and grounded. Then we changed the ending. A silence settled between them, not empty, but electric. She looked at him, truly looked, as if she was trying to decide whether he was real, or just another illusion the cold had given her. I wasn't supposed to survive the crash, she whispered. And yet here you are, he replied. Stephanie's breath faltered. Her fingers curled at her side, then slowly uncurled. She took a single step toward him. You don't even know what I've done. I know what I've seen, he said. And I know who I held when the world was falling apart. Her lips parted slightly. But whatever words were about to come died in her throat. Because then they both heard it. A low, steady hum. It vibrated through the walls. Not wind. Not the groan of old steel. Something else. Something mechanical. Intentional. Ronald turned toward the window. Through the frost-covered glass, he saw it cutting through the storm like a blade of light. A rescue ship. Clean. Sleek. Watching. Stephanie stood beside him now, her shoulder brushing his. They are almost here, she said, barely above a whisper. He nodded. She didn't pull away. And neither did he. His hand found hers cool, uncertain, but it didn't retreat. In the silence between heartbeats, something passed between them. Not fear. Not regret. But choice. Whatever waited outside that door, whatever questions, commands, consequences, they would answer together. Not as fugitive and rescuer. Not as alien and human. Just two people who had found each other in the cold. And decided not to let go. The outpost felt quieter now. Not just because the storm had passed, but because something inside it had settled. Outside, the rescue ship descended slowly, cutting through the morning light with practiced precision. Its polished hull reflected the white wasteland below, a sharp contrast to the ruin it approached. The engines hummed low, steady, almost reverent, as if even the machine understood this wasn't just a mission. It was an arrival. And an ending. Ronald stood near the door, Stephanie beside him, her hand still resting in his. She hadn't let go since the signal had been answered, not even when the first shadow of the ship appeared through the frost-laced window. Neither had spoken in minutes. They didn't need to. Their silence was no longer born from fear. It was agreement. A quiet decision. The wind outside had softened into stillness. And when the outer doors hissed open, light poured into the corridor, cold, bright, absolute. She drew in a slow breath. "You could walk away from this," she said gently, not looking at him. His reply came without hesitation. "So could you." That made her turn. Their eyes met, not searching, not doubting. Just seeing. "I'm not going to," she said. "Neither am I." They stepped into the open together. The crew was already waiting, faces behind visors, weapons slung low, uncertain fingers near quiet triggers. No one moved. No one spoke. Because what they saw wasn't written in any briefing. A human man, weary and worn, stepping out of the wreckage with a woman who wasn't human, yet stood beside him like she'd always belonged there. No explanations. No apologies. Just presence. They didn't stop walking. The snow crunched softly under their boots, each step slow, certain. Stephanie's hand tightened just slightly in his, not from fear, but from something older. Something resolved. When they reached the ramp, she paused, turning to him with a look that carried everything they hadn't had time to say. "If this changes everything," she whispered, "will you still choose me?" He didn't flinch. His answer was quiet. Solid. "I already did." Her smile came slowly, like sunrise after a long night, not bright, but warm in a way nothing else could be. Together, they stepped onto the ship. The door sealed behind them with a low, final breath. And in its wake, the cold remained unchanged. But the silence left behind no longer felt like loss. It felt like a story had been buried in the snow but not forgotten. Because two strangers had met in the quiet. And chose not to let each other go. They only meant to survive the night. But instead, they found each other. Not through words. Not through reason. But in the quiet space between two breaths. And the warmth shared between two souls that never should have met. A human. An alien. Two strangers, lost in a frozen world. And one moment too real to be called chance. And when she whispered, "Don't let go," he held her. Not just to escape the cold, but to hold on to something far more fragile. Trust. If something in this story stirred you, then know this was only a fragment of the many truths yet to be uncovered between humanity and the stars. Follow Alien Chronicles. where encounters don't just shift fate. They make the universe go silent.